Welcome to Hope Ropes. I am Vanessa Azelis, your host, and I share stories of hope, healing, and transformation. I invite you to just get comfortable, listen with an open heart, an open mind, and grab onto these hope ropes. Borrow belief from those who've gone before you until you can hold it for yourself. Today, I am joined by Dr. Matthew Galati, a Toronto based physician whose work is changing the conversation around brain health and recovery. This isn't just something he studies, it's something he has personally lived. And while still a medical student, Dr. Galati was in a serious car accident that left him with a traumatic brain injury and in a coma for days. And instead of accepting the bleak prognosis he received, he began diving into the science of neuroplasticity. And from his hospital bed, he started experimenting with what would later become his own recovery protocol. Within a year, he was back in medical training and has since become an esteemed physician. And in 2019, founded the Brain Changes Initiative, an organization dedicated to improving traumatic brain injury care through education, advocacy, and system level change. Through his work, he spreads awareness and hope for healing to those suffering from TBI. I'm really excited for this conversation. I hope you are too. Welcome, Dr. Galati.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that very beautiful and warm introduction. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, I mean, it was an easy introduction to create because we actually know each other. We've met before this. I had the pleasure of speaking at one of the Brain Changes events at York University a couple years ago, and really just amazed by what you're doing to change the landscape of the way we approach TBI, and also just the way you're weaving neuroplasticity, which is near and dear to my heart. So I thought it'd be a great place for us to start with your story. Obviously, I gave viewers a glimpse into it, but if you were to really bring us back to that event, where it all started for you.
Yeah, it's funny because I think that before my injury, my interests in medicine were completely different. Like I think I wanted to be a cardiologist at one point. Like the brain was not even on my radar, but as fate would have it, January 28th, 2013, I was back home visiting some friends and family for the weekend after writing an exam, a medical school exam. I was a second year medical student at the time, and it was it was a weekend where there was a lot of snow. The weather conditions were very bad, but I had to be back at med school for a mandatory small group session on the Monday morning. So I had no choice but to decide, despite the weather, I have to make my way back to medical school. So I originally had planned on leaving the Sunday night, but the weather conditions were so bad that I thought it's probably best if I left the Monday morning instead. Woke up Monday morning, weather conditions were even worse. I had a passenger with me. He was a student. I was a Western Windsor campus student. So, although the main campus was Western London, the satellite campus was in Windsor. And this friend of mine he was in another program at the university. So, we started our drive, and at about the halfway point between London and Toronto, on the 401 West, the weather was so bad that there was a detour route off the highway. And it was on this detour route where, my car would hit black ice, spun out of control, collided with a tree, hit my head either on the side of the tree or on the side of the car. And the rest is history. I had multiple fractures, rib fractures, skull fractures. I collapsed both my lungs. I severed a nerve in my face. So for months it looked like I suffered a stroke. I couldn't move one side of my face, and I had a bleed inside my brain. And most critically, I had this severe traumatic brain injury and was knocked into a 3-day coma.
Wow. Wow. So that is a lot to take in. Your life is just, you're going as planned. Like we don't ever expect these things to happen. And then when they do, it completely knocks you off your feet essentially. Right. And so bring us to, what was your prognosis? You were in this coma. What did the doctors tell you at this point?
So at this point, my prognosis was very poor. But there is a story, and it's you know a little bit very interesting actually. When I was I was transferred immediately to Woodstock Hospital, and then I was transferred from Woodstock to the nearest trauma center, which was in London, Ontario. So I was in this coma, and nobody really knew when I was going to emerge from the coma. It could have been days, it could have been months, it could have been years. That's the unpredictability of the brain. And my dad said that one day he was in the room with me, and this like strange figure came into the room, and my dad wasn't really sure who he was. He introduced himself as a doctor, and he like checked my reflexes, and he looked at my dad and he said, "Your son is gonna make a full recovery," and just walked out. And then he walked down the hallway, and there was a nurse that was walking in the opposite direction as this person towards my room. This is actually the first time I've told this story
I've
on,
got chills, so keep
yeah.
going.
And the nurse came into the room, and my dad said, "Who was that doctor that just came out of this room?" And she's like, "Who?" And he's like, "He walked right by you. You guys crossed paths." And she's like, "There was nobody who walked by me." So I don't know. It's a little bit
Wow.
like the spooky, and it gives me chills when my dad tells me that story. And I don't know if it was like whatever it is, it was maybe some divine intervention. But
Yeah.
yeah, 3 days later, I emerged from the coma, and I couldn't talk, I couldn't walk. I was very disoriented. I ripped out all my IV lines and my intubation tube, and yeah, the prognosis was very poor. The medical providers were guarded in any expectations they were giving my family about my potential return to my studies. The common dogma of thought at the time was that the brain is a fixed organ. There's no room to create new brain cells for the brain to, heal or recover to any large extent. So yeah, it was not looking good when I emerged from the coma.
Wow. First of all, that story is remarkable. I share stories like this as well because many of us have these moments where there's no explanation. Like you said, this divine intervention, this experience that we don't understand, but that offers us comfort in that moment. That moment for your family who must have been just crushed, right? Just to see you in your state, devastated, and then to have this encounter and then hope, right? The seed of hope planted. That's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And then for you to wake up, like, how can you deny that there is more to the world than we can touch, feel, and see? So thank you so much for sharing that. So you wake up and obviously disoriented, and you have this battle, uphill battle, probably obviously not linear. What happened? So you woke up, and then what were the next steps? Was it traditional rehabilitation? Like, what happened?
So when I woke up, I was, already showing signs that I was like not going to go down without a fight. Like, I was probably the problem patient trying to get out of bed. Like, um, so, uh, you know, I had already been showing, signs that like, I was again going to fight to get better. Like I said, trying to get out of bed, trying to walk, trying to, so there was some indication that like, you know, my functionality was, it wanted to come back. I spent few more days in acute care in London, in the ICU, and then I was eventually transferred to a step down unit at Sunnybrook, which was closer to home for me. And on this neuro step down unit, one of my sister's friends, who's an occupational therapist, she came in to visit me, and she brought a book which really became, the first ray of hope for me that early in my recovery. It was a book called My Stroke of Insight. I'm not sure if you've heard of it,
I read it.
with Jill Bolt. So she was a neuroscientist and had suffered this massive stroke where, very similar to my story, she lost complete functionality, almost went back to childhood state, couldn't really articulate, couldn't talk, couldn't walk. And basically it took her 8 years, but she talks about eventually how she retrained her brain fully and again went back to living a very meaningful life and ended up writing a book about her story. And that was really the introduction for me into this concept of neuroplasticity and the
Mm.
brain's immense ability to adapt, rewire, and change. So from there, I was brought home for a short period of time. And then I was eventually admitted to Toronto Rehab Hospital, which is a big rehab hospital in Toronto. And it was there that I was working with all of the various allied healthcare professionals, occupational therapy, speech language pathology, physiotherapy, psychotherapy. And I um I was enrolled in a research study there,
Mm.
which the goal of which was to intensify all of my so I was receiving double the all of those allied healthcare professional trainings. And the goal of which of this study was to see if it wasn't to say like, oh well, this has this effect, this has it was just very almost like a very at a very basic fundamental level. If we give somebody more therapy, will they
Mm.
make a better recovery? And as part of this study, I had to write a series of 4 neuropsych evaluations at different intervals of time, which tested all of my cognitive functions like my memory, attention, speed of processing. And the first one I wrote was while I was still a patient at Toronto Rehab at the end of my stay. And although I'd made some good gains, it was very clear that it was going to still be an uphill battle for me to return to my medical studies. It was going to take a
Mm.
lot of hard work and determination. So there were some recommendations from my inpatient rehab team to my outpatient rehab team when I was discharged back home about some things that I needed to work on. And I was discharged home. And at home, because I was such a stubborn patient and knew where to look for information as well and how to interpret information as a second year medical student, I started doing all my own research around lifestyle pillars of brain health and ways that I could support my recovery in addition to all of the therapies that I was doing with my rehab team in the outpatient setting. And and yeah, that's kind of where I developed this rehab regimen for myself that I did on a daily basis that supplemented all of the therapies that I was doing.
Awesome. So kind of the, self-directed neuroplasticity was, born in that moment. And I love how you mentioned, one thing that I always talk about is how receiving support on this journey is such a huge piece of it, right? Whether it is physical support, emotional support. You talked about how, you had the rehabilitation support, you worked with all of these people, you had this kind of team, right, which already kind of set you up and almost brought in this element of support and safety, right? But it got
For
you
sure.
to a certain point, and it sounds like you're the type of guy who's like, yeah, I'm not going for like 50%. I'm going all the way. And that tenacity in just like the motivation within you, right? You had this drive and you had this reason why. You're like, I want to go back to medical school. I want to be a doctor. This is not the end. This is just a part of my story. And I see that a lot in those who recover successfully. They have this reason why, this drive. Just even recognizing that, how motivating that can be, and how that's kind of spurred this this journey of kind of creating or cultivating your own protocol, this way of doing things. And that started with researching and learning. And even back then there was no chat GPT. So, it was a little harder to research
For sure.
things. Right. And you really had to find the answers and start to create something that would support you in this next season, right? Because we can think of it that way. You had this initial traumatic event, you got stable, let's say, maybe, and then you're like, okay, but there's more. And so now you have this, beginning of this protocol that would later become, your pillars, right? The way that you approach it with patients. So what was that time frame like? How long did it take from the accident to this point where you started to kind of create your own, protocol?
So that was roughly 2 months,
Alright, so pretty early on, just say
pretty early
you
on.
yeah, and I think that makes a difference as well when we see, people who've been struggling for many years and they have a lot of the stories and their identity then becomes the illness and they start immersing themselves in this acceptance of this is just how I'm always gonna be. I find it's so much harder to rewire that,
For
right?
sure.
And change the brain. So almost time, the fact that you even, began this journey so early on, I think was such a huge advantage for you. Not to say that the brain can't change if it's been years.
Point I wanna say that, like, there definitely are prognostic factors that would predict a good recovery. One of the, I mean, you mentioned support. Support is a huge positive prognostic factor for a good recovery. Not only did I have the support of an amazing rehab team, but my family and close friends were so supportive, and my family was from day one, always advocating for me. My sister worked at Loblaws head office. She was in charge of managing, natural value, and was always looking for supplements and things that I could do to help with my recovery. My dad was always trying to, look for other professionals that I could see that would help with my recovery. Another positive prognostic factor, like you mentioned, is like time after injury. So, you know, there was kind of this thought that like you have a 2-year window to recover. After that, neuroplasticity kind of stops, which is absolutely false. The brain is always changing, always recovering, always shedding connections and creating new connections. That said, like you mentioned, the closer you are to time of injury, the faster and the better recovery takes
Yep.
place, because you're almost like starting on a blank slate, to make
Yeah.
it very, very simple. And yeah, your brain creates new connections fast. And the more you reinforce certain connections or a certain narrative to yourself, the stronger those connections are going to become in your brain. So if you're reinforcing a negative thought pattern to yourself, you are ingraining that into your brain, and it becomes harder and harder to deviate from that path.
Yes. Yeah, exactly, right? And you talk a little bit about consistency too, right? Because we know with neuroplasticity, there needs to be consistency. And so it's like where you said repeating the same thought patterns, repeating the same beliefs over and over again, the same exercises over and over again. The brain has no choice but to get on board with that. So it's like, well,
Exactly.
what are you feeding it? What story are you telling it? What identity are you embodying? And the brain will adapt to that. It has no choice but to change over time, right?
Yep.
That's just how it is. It's always changing. So, okay, so what did that look like for you initially when you started to? I mean, you read the book, you had some insight, and you started to now adapt your own kind of way, like you said, daily doing these things. What did that look like for you?
So I touched on one book that I read that really was my introduction to the fact that recovery was possible. But there was another very important book that I read in the outpatient setting that really became my Bible for recovery. And it was a book called Spark: The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain by John J. Rady. And this book starts off by talking about a school district on the outskirts of Chicago. And there's nothing remarkable about this school district. They didn't put more money into it, or, the students weren't any smarter than any other school district. But the one thing that was very unique was that they revolutionized their gym program such that all their students would exercise rigorously at the beginning of every day to prime their brain for learning. And the really
Oh,
amazing thing is, after changing this gym program, this one school district scored number 1 in the world in science, number 6 in the world in math
wow.
on international standardized testing. And then the book goes on to talk about all the amazing benefits that aerobic exercise has in the brain. And by aerobic exercise, put simply, I mean exercise which elevates your heart rate and breathing. So, exercise, to speak to some of these benefits, it increases the flow of blood and oxygen to the brain, and it helps distribute neurochemicals around the brain that improve mental processing. Also upregulates dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, which are neurohormones that, again, help with processing. It creates new brain cells by upregulating a hormone in the memory center of your brain, the hippocampus, called brain-derived neurotrophic factor,
Mm,
and so or simply BDNF. And what BDNF is it's miracle grow for brain cells, very simply.
amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's all these, and it's also anti-inflammatory to the brain and the body. So there's all these immense benefits. So I started running 5 kilometers every morning to create these new brain cells, and then I would go home and fill these newly created brain cells with meaningful information by stimulating my brain any way I could think of. I was practicing the guitar for fine motor skills. I was reviewing notes I'd missed in med school to practice my memory and attention. And then I was also, in addition to, so those are the first two pillars, aerobic exercise. But now actually the research shows that it's kind of extended to other forms of exercise as well that are good for the brain, like resistance strength
Resistance.
training
Yeah.
also is neuroplastic. And maybe we should talk a little bit about neuroplasticity just for
Yes,
the
yes.
viewers.
Let's do that.
Very simply, neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to adapt, rewire, and change.
Yep.
And exercise stimulates neurogenesis. Genesis is create, and neuro is, the brain is creating new brain cells.
Yep.
So neurogenesis is part of neuroplasticity, and it's one of the things that exercise does. The second pillar is cognitive activity, so stimulating different areas, functional domains of your brain. Some of the other pillars that I read about and researched and implemented it into my recovery were brain healthy diet, so nutrition, because your brain needs the right building blocks to heal and recover. Sleep hygiene. Sleep is essential for the brain. It's actually the last part of neuroplasticity. It's when the brain consolidates
Mhm.
everything that you've learned, and it's also when the brain detoxifies and flushes out all the toxins that build up. Limiting harmful exposures on that note is another pillar. So yes, there's things that everybody kind of knows to avoid for brain health, like alcohol and smoking, because they have really bad effects on, the vasculature of your brain, and they're also inflammatory processes. But there's also some other exposures that maybe are less commonly thought about, like the effects of harmful pesticide residue on brain cells, heavy metal exposure. The list goes on and on and
Yeah.
on. And then the last pillar is mindfulness meditation. And what mindfulness does, this, number one, it's neuroplastic as well. It helps create brain changes, and it also stimulates neurogenesis, the creation of brain cells. But it um to distill things down, it helps you filter out distractive thoughts about past or future, so you could be ultra focused on the present and structuring these
Mm.
new healthy neural connections. So
Yes.
that was kind of my recovery protocol, and those are the pillars that I stand by, and the pillars that I preach to help others make recovery from brain injury or any pathology with the brain, for that matter. The brain is a very complex organ, but what's brain healthy is brain healthy. So in some ways, it could be very simple, because the same pillars that apply to brain injury also apply to depression, anxiety, um, all these other conditions. That said, I do want to take a step back and say that, um, you know, later with my functional medicine training, I learned about, exercise in a little bit more detail, and about dysautonomia, and some of the effects that exercise can have on dysautonomia. And exercise may have to be modified for certain conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome or POTS, where, exercise can make somebody very, very symptomatic. So some strategies that could be used are, supine exercises. So laying flat, so you're not getting that, postural symptomatic response with POTS or chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah, that's actually what I started doing. I was lying down because I had, POTS and chronic fatigue as well. So it started I tell everybody, I'm like, it started with me just laying down, and I had, these resistance bands that I would put on my legs and, like, slowly starting to just move. I
Yeah.
just knew in my brain I had to move. So there was
for
this
sure.
something without knowing what I know now. It was just this intuitive knowledge to say like I know there's something to movement. I have to move. And prior to that, I was like I was a gym rat. I used to jog. I was very strong, and so I love that you brought that up because for even for myself, I think when I teach my clients who again most people have dysautonomia or some form of like POTS, chronic fatigue, nervous system dysregulation is movement. And there's so many people who are bedbound. And that's kind of obviously it makes things harder. But I always say, well, what is possible right now? You know,
Yeah.
can we get creative here? Can we start and maybe it's not aerobic exercise at first, but you're gonna, you know, maybe walk a little bit. Like even walking, I know for myself as I rewired my brain, I coupled walking with my visuals and
Yeah.
meditations. Like I would do a walking meditation. I would connect to the music that was elevating my emotional state. And I would move my body and then notice the embodiment of like how did it feel to walk on the pavement and to feel the ground supporting me. I would look around and orient to my surroundings and take in the sounds and sights. So it was this immersive experience of all of these senses. And I know that that helped to rewire my brain. I know that that brought in a sense of safety, right? So that my limbic brain could kind of turn off that alarm, and allow for some of this change to take place. So I your approach sounds very holistic and again, very aligned with, the work that I do as well, right? And like you said, it's not just for traumatic brain injury, it's for like any pathology essentially, right? And also if you're not sick, quote unquote.
Yeah,
All of these things are supportive for a healthy lifestyle, right?
for sure. I mean, it's interesting because in the book Spark, it talks about how, the evolution of man and how, our ancestors they were hunters and gatherers, right? They were nomads. So it takes thousands of years for genes to change, and we have largely the same genetic makeup that our ancestors did that were hunters and gatherers, right? So our bodies demand a certain level of exercise that,
Mm,
society now is very sedentary. Like we
yeah,
are not giving our bodies what they need in terms
yeah,
of anything, in terms of, nutrition, in terms of exercise level, in terms of, focusing on all of these lifestyle pillars. Healing a brain is not there is no magic pill to heal a brain. It's a holistic approach. It's creating this, you know, perfect environment. And obviously, it's hard to create a perfect environment. People have
yeah,
children. There's other stressors and responsibilities, but you have to try your best to control what you could control, right?
yeah,
It's like
exactly.
I use the analogy of a garden. Like you can't grow flowers in a frozen tundra. You need sunlight, you need fertile soil, you need moisture. All of these conditions help flowers grow, and the
Yeah.
brain is the same. If you give it the best environment, it's going to thrive.
Yes. I love that. So bring us back to this recovery process. So now you're bringing in all of these elements, you're implementing the six pillars. Was that like an all day thing, or did you kind of limit it to certain times of day? Like, what did that look like for you?
Well, obviously, diet is diet, and I would try to build it into all like healthy diet into my meals. I started buying all of my produce organic to limit like the harmful effects of pesticides. Exercise, I would try to do in the morning,
Mm,
and that may not be best for everybody, but that is what was best for me. And I feel like that's what's best for most people because exercise can be, activating. Mind you, I was very, with a healing brain, was very, very tired after performing
mm,
exercise. Like I would run 5 kilometers every morning and then I would go home and kind of take a brief nap before starting my cognitive activities for the day. I would go to
okay.
the library and start
Yeah.
go over notes I'd missed in med school. I would pick like one or two other activities to do for the day to stimulate different parts of my brains, like some of the other ones that I mentioned, guitaring, etc. Journaling, I did a lot of reading and, summarizing what I had read at different intervals of time to see if my retention was there.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I mean, there is an element of, in addition to kind of creating a structure for yourself, listening to your body, it's important to, like, your body knows when it needs to rest, it knows when it needs to sleep. So it's important not to ignore those signals either. Like when I needed to nap and I felt like my brain was not able to process information, I would take a short nap. And the brain definitely needs more rest in those, uh, you know,
yeah.
that short time window after suffering something so traumatic. And yes, the sleep hygiene before bed, limiting screens. I would practice mindfulness in the morning when I wake up, but also to help me relax before bed. So it was kind of a mixture of listening to my body, creating a structure, using time windows that made most sense to me in terms of, like, you know, when can I capitalize most off of the benefits that exercise has on my cognition? So, I would, after doing the exercise, I would try to front load my cognitive activities so that I was doing most of them, in the morning or early afternoon when my brain was freshest and after
Mm,
exercise.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So, do you have a time frame? Like, when did you start to really see improvement, in, and maybe even backtracking, what were the symptoms you experienced? Like, what were you dealing with traumatic brain injury? What were some of the symptoms? You mentioned like fatigue. What else was there?
Well, cognitive fatigue was the biggest and most pervasive and longest lasting one, and I feel like it is for most people who suffer brain injury. Even with short cognitive activities, my brain would just get very, very exhausted and I would need to nap. So that was a big one for me. And I also suffered headaches, and then I had a plethora of cognitive symptoms. I had difficulty with memory and concentration. My memory, was not great, and then, that took a lot of training, like forcing myself to go to the library and review notes and practice my retention at different intervals of time. Like, it took me, in those early stages of going to the library after suffering my injury, it would take me sometimes like half a day to go through one lecture and make notes. And then slowly, the more I did it, like we said with neuroplasticity, the more you reinforce certain habits and create connections in your brain, the stronger that skill becomes. And yeah, over time my memory retention improved by actively practicing it. And other symptoms, so the gait stuff and the exercise stuff my ability to ambulate actually came back relatively quickly because those connections were so reinforced. I was a high level athlete before my injury. I played high level hockey and soccer. And also I want to say that one of the biggest difficulties that I had after emerging from the coma was speaking, because the area of
Oh,
my brain that was damaged was, and where I had the bleed, was between Broca's and Wernicke's area. So the speech and understanding center, respectively. So I could understand what you were saying to me. I could understand what I wanted to say back to you. I had difficulty putting it into words.
wow.
So initially, I kind of almost had to spell everything out in my brain. I had a lot of word finding difficulties where I couldn't, think of the word that I wanted to say. And then eventually that got better and better and better. And, like, when I returned to medical school, I thought that at that point I was fully recovered. But if I look back in retrospect, I was still recovering, and my brain and speech was still improving.
Wow.
I was still probably, when I returned to medical school, very slow in my speech and stuttering, and that got better and better and better, and my word finding got better and better and better. So those are some of the difficulties that I had.
Okay. Wow. Amazing. So, big challenges, big hurdles, right? They're not
I
little
do
things.
I do
And
wanna say,
yeah,
sorry, that, returning back to medical school so soon after my injury, so after 8 months, was maybe the best thing that I could do in terms of cognitive activity, because
interesting.
I was putting my brain in such a stimulating environment that it had no choice. but to create new connections fast. So that was a huge part of my recovery, and I don't know that it would have been, you know, it was already a good recovery, but I don't know if it would have been as great if I had not forced myself to go back to medicine so soon, because I was not only juggling the demands of medical school, but also it was in Windsor, right, which was away from my family. I had to learn how to live for myself again. I had to learn how to cook for myself again. I had to, you know, basically live independently, which is a cognitive activity in and of itself.
That's so interesting. And I love that you brought that up because I know there are many people who are in recovery from various things right now that are kind of holding off on doing anything, taking a big step towards something, right? Like starting a course or getting a part-time job, and they're waiting to get to this place where they have like full, they believe they're at full capacity and all symptoms have subsided and they're in this perfect place. I know for myself as well, I, recovered but still had symptoms. I was a lot better and I was kind of forced to go back to work. I'm like, I'm going to lose my house. I have to go back to work, and kind of I was put in a new position, a new role, had to learn like all this new stuff. And I always say this was a part of my recovery, stepping into this new role and learning in this new experience, new environment, that was so. I always see of it, it's like we live as we heal and we heal as we live as well, right? The living
Love
needs
that.
to be a part of the healing. Yes, there's going to be a time where you need to pause, right? But we can't wait for this perfect moment to step out and take that leap. And you said 8 months of an intentional, practices with all of these pillars. You were back at school and you thought like, "Ooh, I made it." But then it's like you were there and then healing continued to happen.
Yes,
And it evolved and your brain continued to change, and then your definition of healed changed too because it's, and I would say you're probably even still noticing benefits
absolutely.
from what you're doing at this, place in your journey, right? Wow, that's just, yeah, it's so amazing. So what does it look like? So you went to school, obviously graduated. You're a doctor now. You're a practicing general practitioner, if I'm correct.
Yes.
And I know you created Brain Changes which is a nonprofit, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. When did this come about? How did it come about? And what are you doing with it now?
Yes. So thanks for asking. So I completed my family medicine residency, and then I went on to do a 1 year fellowship in integrative medicine, or lifestyle medicine, for people who don't know what integrative medicine is, which is, the focus is on treating the root cause of things and creating this perfect, this holistic environment for the brain and the body to heal. So that was a very big part of my education, and kind of supplemented and gave a name to the way I treated my own brain injury, because I used this holistic approach, but I didn't know about this, you know, this term or this area of medicine called integrative medicine.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, after, when I was recovering from my injury, I was almost like embarrassed and ashamed of my injury, and when I returned back to medicine, there was such a stigma around brain injury and its ability to heal that, I kind of said, well, when I become a doctor, I never want to talk about this ever again. I kind of just want to lock this in a closet and like keep it there. That was a dark period of my life, and I'm through it, and I want to move forwards. And then my family and myself, we kind of took a step back and we said, well, we've learned so much through this journey, and like, it's not an easy journey. It's like the system is very fragmented, like, and brain injury is not like well taught in medicine, and it was a lot of us kind of navigating the path on our own. And we said, well, we could really help a lot of people through our experience. So we decided to start the Brain Changes Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization, and the mission of Brain Changes is to improve the standard of care for traumatic brain injury. And we do that through funding clinical translation of research. So, not research that's just going to sit in the lab. And this is research that's going to make real impacts on patients immediately. because all this research was out there when I was recovering about neuroplasticity and exercise and lifestyle pillars, but it wasn't being integrated into the medical school curriculum. So you could only imagine what the average everyday person thought about the brain's capacity to heal. Other ways we want to drive a change in standard of care is through education, awareness, and support. So that's the mission of Brain Changes. And the way we kind of think we need to drive this change in standard of care is really threefold. So one, at the research level, again, clinical translation of research. So research is very important in order to integrate anything clinically for it to become standard of care. And we're doing that right now through, right now, we're creating a six pillar holistic model of care for traumatic brain injury patients.
Awesome.
And it's going to be integrated once the program is put together, and administered using all of the allied healthcare support at the family health team that I work at in Scarborough. So it's going to be completely publicly funded, and yeah, that uh, takes a huge burden of care off of the patient and the system as a whole, because a lot of these therapies that people would need to recover are, it's just not affordable for somebody unless they have access to motor vehicle accident insurance or they have the
Yep.
means to pay for it themselves. The second way we think we need to drive a change in the standard of care is through teaching the teachers. So, teaching other healthcare practitioners these approaches. And we do that through our educational events like our Brain Health Summit, which is a conference style event that is 1 to 3 days of complete brain health, where there's TED Talk style speakers ranging from people with lived experience to researchers, experts, and medical practitioners, all speaking to the different pillars of lifestyle for the brain. And then there's brain healthy vendors, there's meals. It's a completely immersive experience. And the last way we feel that we need to drive a change in standard of care is by distilling this information down to the average everyday person who may not understand that the brain has these immense capacities and abilities to heal. So we do that through all the information education that we put out through our Brain Changes Instagram, and then also through our awareness events. Like every summer, we host something called our Move for Neurogenesis, which is a bi-weekly move, which is a great way to get people active, but also what a great way to spread awareness around the immense benefits that exercise has in the brain. And then we try to build in all the other pillars, like we again bring brain healthy snacks for people, etc. So that's Brain Changes in a nutshell. We also have a support group, which is led by neural research students across Canada, and it's called the Wolves Den. And basically, it is completely solutions based. So every week, different speakers are brought in to give people tools that they would need to apply to their own recoveries in their lives for to support their brain health.
Wow, that's amazing. So, I mean, I can clearly see your passion for this because this is a lived experience and, so much that you're offering, just because you do want to make this change so that others don't have to go through the process of like figuring it out like you had to. But, what a gift that you've been able to pass on. And I can totally relate. I think a lot of people, when they recover at first, are like, I just want to forget that this happened and like just live my life. But then there's that something inside us, call it purpose, call it, part of us that wants to make meaning from this. I always say God uses everything, like nothing is ever wasted, nothing is ever lost in that sense. And it sounds like, I mean, clearly God's using you in this way, your story, your testimony, your recovery to help others. So I think I'm just in awe of what you've created. And, I think many people watching this probably, come from at least maybe have some medical trauma. I know for myself and most people that I've worked with. And then we paint all doctors with the same brush and we assume that they don't know what they're talking about. But then we have, someone like you, that is proof and evidence that the landscape of Western medicine is changing, right? That, you are part of that massive change where they're really starting to see the power of neuroplasticity, but also of these 6 pillars of meditation, of movement, of, supports and managing stress and all of this. And I think it's an exciting time to be here really because we're starting to see it in real time. And if I were to ask you, let's say this didn't happen to you. All right, let's say you never went through this. How would you be different from a doctor perspective? Like, would you be incorporating all of the things that you learned, or would you, be a standard physician with what you learned in medical school?
That's a good question, and it's hard to know 1,000%, but yeah, I don't think that I would be as holistic minded and really like the patient experience. I tell people all the time that like you know everything that I've learned about the brain and about healing a brain, a lot of it didn't come from my training as a doctor. People listen to me because I'm a doctor, but really you know, everything, most things that I learned about the brain and how to heal a brain came from my own experience as a patient. And,
Yeah.
navigating the system on my own with my family and, figuring out what works, doing all my own research. And yeah, in a way, like the most traumatic thing that could ever happen to me in my life became maybe my biggest blessing because it really has become my purpose. And yeah, I wouldn't trade it for the world.
That's amazing. So, as we wrap this up, first of all, just such a pleasure to have you on. Again, this is bringing so much hope to so many. And for those who are interested in brain changes and the resources they provide, everything will be in the description of the video so that you can access the Wolves Den and all the other events that they have coming up. But if we were to end off with this, for someone who is in the throes of it, struggling from traumatic brain injury or another illness and they're feeling hopeless, what is a piece of advice that you could give them, or what's a hope rope that you could throw them?
I would say that there's so much that you could do to change your situation and never be afraid to be your own biggest advocate because when you go home and after you see your doctors, yes, your doctors know a lot and they're a wealth of information, but it is a job for them, right? And when they go home, the only person who is going to care, not that they don't care, but the person that's going to care the most about your situation is going to be yourself and your family. So knowledge is power. Go home, do
Mm,
research around your own, recovery and ways that you could support your healing and take your power back. Put the power in your hands. That's the
I love
message that I want to give everybody.
Yes, yes. We both did it, and that's why we're here doing what we're doing. I appreciate you so much for being on today and for sharing your story, Matthew. And for anyone who wants to reach out to him or through Brain Changes, you'll have the info below. So thank you again
Thanks,
for being
Vanessa.
here.